The Odyssey from Universal Studios and Christopher Nolan might be a big hit with legacy Access Hollywood media critics, but according to Deadline magazine, might be about to hit a giant financial brick wall at the box office. With a movie that cost nearly $500 million all in between production and marketing, this movie's going to have to score close to $1 billion at the retail box in order for it to break even. And if these numbers from Deadline are accurate, it's in some deep trouble. Renegade Online. All right, now I know I'm sure I'm going to catch a bunch of flack from this for the Nolan fan club out there and those that are stumping for the Odyssey, but I've just got to call it like I see it. Now, on one hand, a movie like this that is probably going to bring in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars at the retail box office is a little difficult to look at it and say it could be a flop. But the reality is, when you look at it from a pure financial and business perspective, which is what we do here, considering the massive investment from Universal, it may well just be that. Let's take a look at the Deadline article and let me show you what I'm talking about, because there's a lot of folks out there trying to make comparisons to things like Oppenheimer and Avatar out there of how this movie could potentially leg out, but there's some problems with those theories, some very big problems. From Deadline magazine, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey to begin its epic journey with around $200 million worldwide. Sounds like a lot of money, but it really isn't for a movie like this. A year after selling out 70mm IMAX, Showtime's Universal's second Christopher Nolan movie after his multi-Oscar award-winning Oppenheimer, The Odyssey finally arrives. While we had a puffy projection last week for Disney's Moana of $130 million in worldwide box office, fueled by lofty tracking, few sources see the feature take of Homer's epic poem getting sidelined by sirens or moviegoers seduced by Calypso and held captive on a deserted island. The big question is, how much does the Odyssey over-index? And if it doesn't, it's due to appointment viewing, as the pitch here is to watch the feature in IMAX in the way it was shot and meant to be seen. So already we're hearkening back to Deadline effectively apologizing for grossly overestimating the performance of Moana, which is another $250 million net production cost by the Walt Disney Company. A very similar figure to what is being reported for the Odyssey, although I think the Odyssey probably vastly outstrips it. Remember, just because we get reported budget numbers, it doesn't always mean that they are the actual final costs. And we've documented this time and time again for years here on Valiant Renegade. It's what we do. When you have movies like Disney's Star Wars that cost over $500 million to produce before they spend a dime to market them into theaters, and they still report the actual production budget of being $250, well, you get where I'm going with this. Now, I don't have any information out there that says the Odyssey was wildly beyond its stated budget, but I would suspect if history is any guide, it's probably a little light in the loafers. But let's talk about this issue of appointment viewing, because this is a good argument that Deadline is making, one that is founded in logic and reason given the financial data that we have to this point, meaning that people are very interested in seeing this on the biggest screen possible. Sounds a lot like Avatar. But I don't think this is going to perform like Avatar for a number of reasons. Yeah, people might be stretching out, meaning they're not going to load the box office or front load the box office in its opening weekend because they want to go see it on the biggest screen they can, meaning they're willing to wait a little bit longer. Unlike certain Marvel and Star Wars movies where people will front load the box office and then we see a 60+% drop off in weekend two. I don't know if that's going to happen with the Odyssey, but there's several problems here. Number one, the Odyssey has about 14 days to make its nut on all these PLFs, because at the end of July, The next Spider-Man movie from Sony is dropping, and that's going to suck all of the oxygen out of the room, and I don't care who you are. And then there's the Oppenheimer comparison, or Barbenheimer, as it was. That was a very special one-off. That's not something that we should expect to see happen year in and year out. In fact, it never really happened before Barbenheimer, and it's probably going to be a long time before we see something like that again. Can the Odyssey replicate that kind of magic? It's possible, although there's nothing right now to indicate that it will. But let's look at the example of appointment viewing that is, in my opinion, the pinnacle or the quintessential example of such type of viewing with Avatar. Avatar concluded its domestic box office run at $400 million with an opening weekend of merely $89 million. And I say merely, of course, that's a big opening weekend for any film, but with Avatar, when you spend $300 to $400 million making a movie, as James Cameron does, that is something to be concerned. But Avatar also releases at the Christmas box office frame, not in the middle of summer. The difference is with Avatar, when it releases in that frame, it's got 90 to 120 days of clear runway. There's no other major blockbuster that comes out, generally speaking, in a January or a February or even a March that can really push it off the rails. So Avatar, with appointment viewing and people wanting to go see it in IMAX screens again and again, have that opportunity because of the chosen release date. That's not the case with the Odyssey because, again, 2 weeks later, Spider-Man comes out and it's going to be largely game over. Short of course, Spider-Man being an absolute dud. But as of right now, the projections are that Spider-Man is going to open with nearly $200 million at the domestic box office. That's right. The projections for Spider-Man for the domestic box office are potentially bigger than what the Odyssey will see in its opening weekend around the entire planet of Earth.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
But let's then take a look at Oppenheimer, the last big movie that Christopher Nolan produced. The first one that he did after he left Warner Brothers and came to Universal, which I think is largely still in a honeymoon period with Christopher Nolan. Because if Deadline magazine is accurate in its pegging
phrasing
of $145 million for the marketing spend of Disney's Moana, which was an absolute flop, I can promise you right now that the Odyssey is probably seeing closer to $200 million in a global marketing spend. That's on top. It's $250+ million in production, all in cost for the Odyssey, around $500 million. The Odyssey is going to need to probably get close to $1 billion just to hit a break-even point to cover its cost floor. But what about Oppenheimer? What happened here? Christopher Nolan got almost $1 billion out of this movie at the global box office, but there's some difference. Look at the domestic versus international take. It was almost 2-to-1 international. Meaning that for every dollar the domestic box office brought in for Oppenheimer, the international box office brought in $2. Now let's go back to the same Deadline article on their projection for the Odyssey. Currently, we're hearing an opening frame of $85 to $100 million domestic, with another $110 million overseas in 73 territories. Korea, Japan, and China, notably, will be opening at later dates. So we're nowhere close to a 2-to-1 ratio, international versus domestic, for the Odyssey, as we were with Oppenheimer. That should cause some major concern right now for Universal, considering their investment in this. But hey, let's say Japan, Korea, and China perform in similar fashion for the Odyssey that they did to Oppenheimer. Of the $646 million brought in the international box office, the UK was the biggest winner for Oppenheimer at $75.4 million. China was the second largest with $61 million. So in other words, China brought in less than 10% of the total international box office. South Korea was way down here at number 6, it looks like, at $25 million. Japan didn't even make the top 10. So let's generously assume that those 3 Asian markets are going to perform in similar fashion and say they'll probably rep maybe somewhere close to around $80 to $100 million of box office for the Odyssey. That's entirely possible. But when you consider that China only returns about 20 to 25% of their retail box office back to an American studio in terms of rental fees, you can start to see why China really doesn't make a difference unless you really have a blowout banger.
Phrasing.
But back to Deadline, what definitely concerns me, apart from all of the major summer competition that is still coming, namely Spider-Man 2 weeks after this opens, is the other issue of the appointment viewing, which again will work for Avatar because of when it releases, and not so much in this case for the Odyssey unless Spider-Man turns out to be a complete dud. The issue here is that the over-indexing of IMAX, because of all of this anxiousness to get to see it on the big screen, I think the Odyssey is going to be one of the most over-indexed movies that we've ever seen, apart from Avatar, for IMAX. And that can only get you so far. At the end of the day, you need to get butts in seats. You need word of mouth. You need people to talk about this movie. The problem is that it's 3 hours long. Once you factor in things like trailers and travel time to and from the theater, you're talking about at least a 4-hour commitment of somebody's time to go see this. I'm not saying that people won't do it, but it is a factor. It's also a factor to realize that at a 3-hour runtime, 3.5 hours with trailers, it significantly cuts down the number of screenings that any theater can have in a given day. In this case, by nearly 50%. Over a standard, say, 2-hour or sub 2-hour movie. That's going to impact this as well, especially when time is working against this film that only has 14 days before Spider-Man comes out. I can't sit here and definitively predict that the Odyssey is going to be a financial bomb for Christopher Nolan and for Universal Studios. Sure, one of the things that Universal has working for it is their very lucrative $1 billion a year deal with somebody like Netflix out there. They're going to be footing the bill for this movie in a not insignificant amount. But then again, a movie like this does not go to the theater with the intention of having to go into the pay 2 and pay 3 windows to recover just its cost floor. It's looking to make profits up front. No studio spends $500 million to go to the theater and say, well, we'll finally make that cost up in the next 2 to 3 years. No, this has got to perform. And with a $200 million opening globally, this movie's going to have to leg out to a 4 or 5x in order for it to recover that cost floor. It's just simple math. And as of right now, I'm not sure that's going to happen. Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.